They told everyone that I had lost my mind to take my $15 million savings. But at the court hearing, I did. The man my son Leo brought into my home had the softest hands I'd ever shaken. Dr. Alistair Finch, he was called. An old friend from college, Leo had said, a psychiatrist visiting from out of state. He had a gentle, almost apologetic smile and eyes that seemed to absorb the light in the room rather than reflect it. My daughter-in-law, Clara, hovered nearby, her own smile stretched so tight I thought it might crack the porcelain veneer of her face. She refilled his water glass, fussed over the throw pillows on the sofa, and radiated an aura of solicitous concern that felt utterly alien in my living room. "Mom, Alistair was just so keen to meet you," Leo explained, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I talk about you all the time." I offered a polite, non-committal smile, my gaze sweeping over the scene. The fine china teacups I'd set out. The antique mahogany table polished to a high gleam. The vast, sun-drenched room that my late husband, Richard, had designed to feel like an extension of the gardens outside. This house, this life, every carefully curated piece of it, was a testament to the $15 million fortune Richard had built from nothing. A fortune that was now mine, and which, until that very moment, I had believed was a bedrock of security for my only child. But something was wrong. The air was thick with unspoken intentions. Dr. Finch wasn't asking the usual questions of a friendly acquaintance. He wasn't interested in my garden club or my recent trip to Florence. His questions were probes, expertly disguised but sharp as needles. He asked if I was sleeping well, if I ever felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of managing such a large estate. He wondered aloud if I sometimes found myself misplacing things or forgetting appointments. Each question was delivered with that same gentle, apologetic smile, as if he were merely making casual conversation. Beside him, Leo would nod subtly, a silent confirmation of a narrative I wasn't privy to. Clara would sigh, a delicate, theatrical sound of sorrow. It was when Dr. Finch asked about my episodes of confusion that the floor fell out from beneath me. The question was slick, inserted between a comment about the beautiful Degas print on my wall and an inquiry about Richard's passing. "Leo mentioned you've had some difficult moments recently, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice a clinical caress. "It's perfectly understandable." Grief can manifest in very disorienting ways. I looked at my son. Leo, my beautiful boy, the child I had raised with every ounce of my love and a considerable portion of my wealth. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second before looking down at his hands, a portrait of filial anxiety. In that fleeting glance, I saw it all. This wasn't a friendly visit. It was an assessment, an evaluation. They had brought a psychiatrist into my home under false pretenses to collect evidence that I was losing my mind. They were building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. The goal was clear, chilling, and breathtaking in its cruelty: to seize control of my $15 million. The shock was a physical blow, sucking the air from my lungs and replacing it with ice. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I felt a wave of dizziness, the room tilting slightly. For a terrifying second, I thought I might actually faint, proving their unstated point for them. My hand trembled as I lifted my teacup, the clatter of porcelain against saucer sounding like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. I saw a flicker of triumph in Clara's eyes. I managed to steer the conversation to a bland, polite conclusion, my mind a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. I walked them to the door, my movements stiff, my smile a frozen mask. Leo hugged me, a gesture that now felt like a violation. "Take care of yourself, Mom," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. It was a threat disguised as affection. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, my legs gave out. I sank onto the cold marble of the foyer, the carefully constructed world I had inhabited for 55 years shattering into a million pieces. The silence of the house pressed in on me, vast and suffocating. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a gilded prison where I was being judged, a tomb they were preparing for me while I was still breathing. For hours, I didn't move. I just sat there, replaying the scene, the subtle cues, the calculated questions, the false sympathy. Every memory of the past few years began to realign itself into a horrifying new pattern. Their constant need for money, which I had seen as youthful irresponsibility, now looked like a systematic draining of my resources. Their insistence on helping me with my complicated finances, which I had interpreted as a sign of their care, was a clear attempt to gain access and control. Every complaint about my forgetfulness, misplacing my keys, forgetting a lunch date, which I had dismissed as normal signs of aging, was now revealed as a piece of data they were collecting. A profound, soul-crushing shame washed over me. How could I have been so blind? I, who had sat on charity boards and navigated complex investments alongside Richard. I, who prided myself on my perceptiveness. I had been played for a fool by my own son and the woman he had married. They didn't see a mother. They saw a vault, and they had just inserted the key to pry it open. The tears came then, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness for a relationship lost. That grief would come later. They were tears of pure, impotent rage. Rage at their betrayal. Rage at my own stupidity. I had financed their lavish lifestyle, their downtown loft, their European vacations, Clara's failed boutique, Leo's series of startups that never started. I had handed them the very resources they were now using to orchestrate my demise. The self-blame was a bitter acid in my throat. I had spoiled him, protected him from the consequences of his actions, and in doing so, I had created a monster who now saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and a life of permanent, effortless luxury. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I wandered through the silent, moonlit rooms of my house, touching the objects Richard and I had collected over a lifetime. Each one felt like an accusation. They were part of the prize my son was willing to destroy me for. I stood before the portrait of my late husband, his kind, intelligent eyes seeming to look at me with a pained expression. "What have you done, Evelyn?" I imagined him asking. "What have you allowed to happen to our son? To our legacy?" I had no answer. There was only the hollow echo of my own failure and the chilling realization that this was not the end of their plan. It was just the beginning. The dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, but the darkness inside me remained absolute. The shock from the previous day had subsided, leaving behind a cold, heavy sediment of reality. The emotional agony of betrayal was still there, a raw wound in my chest, but something else was beginning to stir beneath it. The iciness of pure, unadulterated reason. I was a fool, yes, but I had been a fool for the last time. I went into Richard's study, a room I had mostly kept as he left it, a sanctuary of leather-bound books and the faint, lingering scent of his cigar smoke. It had always been a place of comfort, of rational thought. Now, it would become my war room. I bypassed the sentimental photograph albums and went straight for the steel filing cabinet in the corner. For years, my financial advisor had urged me to keep meticulous records, a habit I had maintained with discipline. Now, that discipline would be my salvation. I pulled out the files, one for each of the last 5 years. Bank statements, credit card bills, wire transfer receipts, canceled checks. I spread them across the massive oak desk, the sheer volume of paper a testament to my naivety. With a pot of black coffee at my side, I began the grim task of counting my losses. It was a journey back through my own willful blindness, an archaeological dig into the ruins of my misplaced love. The numbers told a story far more brutal than I had ever allowed myself to believe. It wasn't just helping out with their rent. It was everything. A $50,000 loan for one of Leo's tech ventures that vanished without a trace. The $120,000 I'd paid to clear Clara's business debts after her designer consignment shop went under. The down payment on their loft, $250,000. Their 2 luxury cars, both paid for from an account I topped up monthly. The American Express Centurion card, the black card, that I had given Leo for emergencies, which seemed to include weekly dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, first-class flights to Aspen, and what looked like a standing appointment for Clara at a high-end spa. I worked methodically, my pen scratching across a legal pad, the columns of figures growing longer and longer. There were no small amounts. Everything was inflated, extravagant. They lived a life predicated on the assumption that my money was infinite and their right to it absolute. I saw the patterns clearly now. A manufactured crisis would always precede a large withdrawal. Clara would have a sudden, vague health scare, or Leo would be on the verge of a breakthrough deal that required an immediate cash injection. And I, the ever-loving, ever-gullible mother, would rush to the rescue, my heart aching with the fear that my son might fail, that he might not have the perfect life I so desperately wanted for him. By midday, the final tally lay before me, a stark, ugly number written in black ink. Over the past 5 years alone, I had given them just over $1.7 million. The figure stared up at me, obscene and damning. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't help. It was plunder. A slow, methodical siphoning of the future Richard had secured for me. This wasn't about love. It was about liquidation. They were liquidating me, piece by piece, while I smiled and wrote the checks. The emotional pain that had paralyzed me began to transform. It crystallized into something hard and sharp, a diamond of resolve forming under immense pressure. The self-blame didn't disappear, but it was now joined by a cold, righteous fury. My grief for the son I thought I had was replaced by a steely determination to protect myself from the son he actually was. The transition was complete. The weeping mother was gone. In her place sat a CEO whose most valuable asset was under hostile attack. I picked up the phone, my hand perfectly steady, and dialed the number for my private banker, Mr. Harrison, a man I'd known for 20 years. I explained, in a calm, firm tone that brooked no argument, that I was immediately revoking all access Leo had to any of my accounts. The Centurion card was to be canceled, effective immediately. The automatic monthly transfers were to be stopped. I put a verbal freeze on any unusual activity, to be followed by written confirmation from my lawyer. Mr. Harrison, to his credit, asked no questions, merely confirming that he understood and would execute my orders without delay. My next call was more difficult. It was to Leo. He answered on the second ring, his voice oozing the same false concern as the day before. He asked how I was feeling, if I had slept, if I needed anything. The hypocrisy was so thick I could barely breathe. I cut him off mid-sentence. My voice was quiet, devoid of the hysteria or anger he was likely expecting. It was the voice I used to use in board meetings when a negotiation was over. "Leo, this is not a social call," I said, the words falling like chips of ice into the phone. "As of this morning, you and Clara have been removed from all of my financial accounts. The credit cards have been canceled. There will be no more transfers. There will be no more money. Not now, not ever." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could almost hear the gears in his head grinding, switching from the role of concerned son to cornered predator. When he finally spoke, the velvet was gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, disbelieving anger. He demanded to know what was going on, what had gotten into me. He said I wasn't being rational. "On the contrary," I replied, my calmness unnerving him, I could tell. "For the first time in a very long time, I am being perfectly rational. I am choosing to protect myself and the legacy your father left me. Yesterday, you brought a man into my home to question my sanity. You did so with the clear intention of seizing my assets. That was your choice. This is my consequence." He started to bluster, to deny, to accuse me of being paranoid and ungrateful. He said Dr. Finch was just a friend, that they were worried about me. The lies were pathetic now, stripped of their power. "Do not insult my intelligence, Leo," I said, my voice dropping even lower. "The conversation is over. You and Clara are no longer welcome in my home. You are no longer a part of my life. If you attempt to contact me again, you will do so through my lawyer." Before he could respond, I ended the call. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a quiet click that felt like the closing of a tomb. A part of me had died in that conversation, the part that held onto the hope of being a beloved mother. But another part was born. A woman who was choosing herself. For the first time, I was not Evelyn, Richard's widow. I was not Evelyn, Leo's mother. I was just Evelyn, and I would survive. The bond was broken. The war had just been declared. The quiet that followed my decision was deceptive. For 2 days there was nothing. No calls, no messages. The silence was a coiled snake, waiting. I knew it was not an admission of defeat, but a period of regrouping. They had prodded the sleeping dragon and been scorched by its breath. Now they were retreating to devise a new plan of attack. I used the time to solidify my defenses. I had a security consultant, a discreet and highly recommended professional, sweep the house. His findings were chilling. A miniature listening device, no bigger than a thumbnail, was found tucked behind a bookshelf in the study. A keylogger had been installed on my desktop computer. The invasion had begun long before Dr. Finch walked through my door. They hadn't just been collecting anecdotes of my confusion. They had been actively spying on me, listening to my phone calls, reading my emails, searching for any scrap of information they could twist into a weapon. The discovery erased any lingering sentimentality I might have harbored. This wasn't just greed. It was a cold, premeditated conspiracy. The sense of violation was profound, leaving me feeling contaminated in my own home. That evening, every lock in the house was replaced with a high-security system only I had the codes for. The grand iron gates at the end of the driveway, usually left open during the day, were now permanently closed. My home was no longer a welcoming estate. It was a fortress. The attack, when it came, was not subtle. It was a full frontal assault. On the third day, a sleek black town car pulled up to my gates. Through the new security cameras, I watched as Leo and Clara emerged, followed by a man in a ruthlessly tailored suit who carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. They didn't bother with the intercom. Leo began hammering on the gate with his fist, his face a mask of incandescent rage. I let them wait for 10 minutes, watching them on the monitor, a silent observer of their impotent fury. Then, I pressed the button for the intercom, my voice amplified by the speaker. "You are trespassing. Please leave the premises immediately." It was the lawyer who responded, his voice smooth and condescending. "Mrs. Ashton?" "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am legal counsel for your son. We are here out of deep concern for your well-being. Please, open the gate so we can have a civil conversation." "There is nothing to discuss, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the iron between us. "Any further communication can be directed to my attorney." Clara shoved him aside and shrieked into the speaker, the carefully constructed facade of the grieving daughter-in-law completely gone, replaced by a raw, snarling avarice. She accused me of being a monster, of abandoning my family. She screamed that I had lost my mind, that I was being poisoned against them by gold-digging new friends. A fiction they had clearly invented. Leo took over, his threats more direct. He spoke of his legal rights as my son, of his duty to protect me from myself. He warned me that if I didn't open the gate, they would have no choice but to seek a court order to force a wellness check, the first step in a legal battle for conservatorship. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost pathetic. They were using the very language of care and concern to threaten me with the loss of my autonomy. They were accusing me of being paranoid, while simultaneously proving that my every precaution was not only justified, but necessary. I looked at my son's distorted face on the screen, a stranger consumed by a greed I had foolishly funded. There was no love there, no flicker of the boy I once knew. There was only entitlement and rage. "You have 1 minute to leave my property," I said into the intercom, "before I call the police." I watched them confer, their gestures sharp and angry. Mr. Thorne, ever the professional, placed a calming hand on Leo's shoulder and spoke into his phone. Then he addressed the speaker one last time. "Mrs. Ashton, you are making a grave mistake. We will see you in court." They retreated to their car and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation drained away, leaving me trembling. They had declared their intentions openly. The war would not be fought with quiet manipulations anymore, but in the sterile, brutal arena of a courtroom. That afternoon, I received the first official volley. A courier delivered a thick envelope containing a letter from Mr. Thorne's law firm. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It formally expressed my son's grave concerns about my erratic behavior, sudden isolation, and irresponsible financial decisions. It listed my actions, canceling his credit cards, changing my locks, refusing to see him, as evidence of a deteriorating mental state. The letter strongly advised me to consent to a full psychiatric evaluation by a doctor of their choosing and to agree to a temporary power of attorney, granting Leo oversight of my finances, until such time as your stability can be assured. It was a trap, of course. Consenting to their doctor would be professional suicide. Signing over power of attorney, even temporarily, would be the end. They weren't asking. They were creating a paper trail. My refusal would be framed as further proof of my incompetence, my uncooperativeness a symptom of the very illness they accused me of having. The pressure mounted over the next few days. I began receiving calls from distant relatives and old family friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Their scripts were all variations on the same theme. Leo and Clara had reached out to them, painting a tragic picture of my decline. They spoke of my paranoia, my memory lapses, my reclusiveness. They were poisoning the well, isolating me from my own social network, and trying to build a chorus of concerned voices that would echo their claims in court. Some of the callers were genuinely worried, their voices laced with a pity that was more insulting than any accusation. Others were merely enjoying the drama, fishing for gossip. Each call was a fresh assault, a reminder that my reputation, my very identity, was being systematically dismantled by my own child. The invasion wasn't just at my gates. It was in my phone, in my relationships, in the minds of everyone I had ever known. They were trying to erase the competent, intelligent woman I was and replace her with a caricature, a confused, wealthy old woman who needed saving from herself. The onslaught of calls and the lawyer's threatening letter were designed to make me feel isolated and overwhelmed, to corner me into making a mistake. But with every manipulative phone call and every thinly veiled threat, the fear that had initially gripped me hardened into something else, a cold, unyielding resolve. They expected me to crumble. They expected hysteria and panic. I would give them logic and strategy instead. My first act of defiance was to hire my own lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the most formidable one I could find. I didn't look for a simple estate planner. I sought out a specialist, a shark. Her name was Juliana Vance. She was a legend in New York legal circles, known for her work in high-stakes family law and, more specifically, for defending high-net-worth individuals against predatory conservatorship claims. Her reputation was that of an ice queen with a brilliant legal mind, a woman who didn't just win cases, she annihilated her opposition. Our first meeting took place in her stark, minimalist office overlooking Central Park. Juliana was in her late 40s, dressed in a severe charcoal suit, her expression sharp and assessing. She listened to my story without interruption, her eyes never leaving my face. I laid everything out. Dr. Finch's visit, the financial drain, the listening devices, the confrontation at the gate, the letter from Marcus Thorne, the orchestrated campaign of calls. I handed her the file I had compiled, the meticulous record of every dollar they had taken, every email they had sent, every lie they had told. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on her glass desk. "They're moving quickly," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "Thorne is aggressive. His strategy is classic: create a narrative of incompetence, isolate the target, and apply legal pressure until she breaks and agrees to their terms. It's a form of elder abuse, dressed up in the language of concern." For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't pitying me. She was analyzing the enemy's tactics. "They've made several mistakes," Juliana continued, opening my file. "Bringing a psychiatrist into your home under false pretenses is ethically dubious and can be challenged. Planting surveillance devices is illegal. Their paper trail of concern began only after you cut them off financially, which clearly establishes motive. They're greedy, and that's made them sloppy." She looked up at me, her gaze intense. "But make no mistake, Mrs. Ashton, this will be a war. They will try to humiliate you. They will dig for any perceived misstep in your past. They will portray you as a villain, an unstable and cruel mother. Are you prepared for that?" "I am prepared to do whatever it takes to protect what is mine, and to ensure my son never sees another penny of it," I replied, my voice steady. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. Then let's begin." Juliana's first move was a counter-offensive that left Marcus Thorne reeling. She sent him a letter that was the legal equivalent of a nuclear strike. It meticulously documented the illegal surveillance, the fraudulent entry of Dr. Finch, and the 5-year history of financial exploitation. It accused them of harassment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that any attempt to file for a conservatorship would be met with a countersuit for malicious prosecution and damages that would not only bankrupt Leo and Clara, but would also make Mr. Thorne's conduct a matter of review for the State Bar Association. The letter concluded by issuing a formal cease and desist order, forbidding them from contacting me, visiting my property, or speaking about me to any third party. The effect was immediate. The phone calls from concerned relatives stopped. The black town car no longer lurked outside my gates. We had pushed back, hard, and thrown them off balance. But I knew this was just the opening salvo. Juliana warned me they would not give up. The prize was too large. "They will try to find another way in," she cautioned. "They'll look for a vulnerability." To that end, I began to build my own case. I defied their narrative of the isolated, confused old woman by doing the exact opposite. I started reconnecting with my true friends, the ones I had neglected while I was absorbed in Leo and Clara's manufactured dramas. I hosted a small luncheon at my home. At first, my friends were hesitant, their expressions clouded with the worry my son had planted. But as we talked, as they saw me, lucid, articulate, and furious, the clouds parted. I told them the truth, the whole ugly story. The initial shock on their faces gave way to outrage on my behalf. They had seen the signs, they admitted, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Clara's casual condescension towards me, Leo's constant talk of money. My friends became my allies, a wall of support against the lies. I also found a new kind of strange finding. While cleaning out a desk in the guest room, a room Leo and Clara often used when they stayed over, I found a portfolio hidden beneath the drawers. It wasn't mine. It contained detailed printouts of my investment accounts, highlighted and annotated. There were also documents from a high-risk offshore investment firm and, most disturbingly, a forged power of attorney document, not yet signed, that would have given Leo complete control over my assets. It was dated 6 months prior to Dr. Finch's visit. The cold dread that washed over me was different this time. It wasn't fear, it was confirmation. Their plan was not a recent invention born of panic. They had been plotting to seize my fortune for months, perhaps years. They were just waiting for the right moment, for me to seem frail enough, for their narrative to be believable. They hadn't just been draining my accounts, they had been planning a complete takeover. That forged document was the proof I needed. It was a declaration of intent, a smoking gun. I sealed it in an evidence bag Juliana had given me and locked it in my safe. They thought I was a doddering old fool. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The discovery of the forged power of attorney was a pivotal moment. It was no longer a matter of them simply being greedy opportunists. This was premeditated, criminal intent. The fight had shifted from a defensive posture to an offensive one. I was no longer just protecting myself. I was going to dismantle them. My first and most significant act of war was to rewrite my will. Juliana Vance connected me with the sharpest estate lawyer in the city. In a single afternoon, I systematically disinherited my son. The entire $15 million fortune, along with the house, the art, and all other assets, would now be placed into a charitable trust upon my death. The trust would be dedicated to two causes: supporting the arts, a passion Richard and I had shared, and, with a touch of poetic justice, providing legal aid to elderly individuals fighting financial abuse from their families. Leo's name was expunged. In his place, the will now contained a single clause, drafted by Juliana herself, stating that my son, Leo Ashton, had been intentionally omitted for reasons that were well documented and known to him. It was a final, posthumous severing of our bond. The act was both heartbreaking and liberating. It was the closing of a door, the acceptance that the son I had loved was truly gone. But simply cutting him out of my will felt insufficient. It was a passive measure, a final word from beyond the grave. I needed to act now, in the present. I decided it was time to stop reacting to their moves and start making my own. It was time to investigate them. If they were going to scrutinize my life for weaknesses, I would scrutinize theirs for the truth. Juliana connected me with a private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Frank Russo. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man whose rumpled appearance belied a razor-sharp intellect. I hired him with a simple directive: find out everything there is to know about the lives of Leo and Clara Ashton, their finances, their social circles, their secrets. "They've been living on your dime for years, Mrs. Ashton," Frank said, taking notes in a small, worn spiral notebook. "People who live on easy money get sloppy. They leave trails." And they had. Frank's reports began to paint a picture that was even uglier than I had imagined. The $1.7 million I had given them over 5 years had not been invested or saved. It had been incinerated in a bonfire of vanity and status-seeking. Frank uncovered a mountain of debt they had hidden from me. They had multiple high-interest loans from shady lenders. They had maxed out credit cards I didn't even know they had. They were living not just beyond their means, but beyond the lavish means I had provided. Clara's failed boutique had not just been a business misstep, it had been a disaster fueled by incompetence and theft. Frank found 2 former employees willing to give statements that Clara had been paying herself an exorbitant salary while bouncing payroll checks and had sold off most of the inventory for cash to fund her personal shopping habits. Leo's startups were a complete sham. They were nothing more than slick websites and rented office spaces used to impress potential investors. And me. He had produced no products, offered no services. But he had, Frank discovered, taken on several angel investors, friends from wealthy families whom he had charmed with his vision. He had taken their money and produced nothing but excuses. He wasn't just a failed entrepreneur, he was a con artist. The most damning discovery was about Dr. Alistair Finch. He was not, as Leo claimed, a casual college friend. Frank found that Finch's psychiatric practice was in serious financial trouble. He had recently been reprimanded by the state medical board for ethical violations related to overprescribing medication. More importantly, financial records showed that 2 weeks before his visit to my house, a shell corporation owned by Leo had paid Dr. Finch $25,000. It wasn't a friendly visit, it was a paid consultation. They had hired a compromised psychiatrist to produce a biased assessment. Every report from Frank was another nail in their coffin. I filed each one away, my evidence folder growing thicker by the day. As I learned more about their duplicity, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The pain of betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my heart, but it was overshadowed by a grim sense of purpose. I was like a surgeon cutting away a diseased part of my own body. The procedure was painful and gruesome, but necessary for survival. During this time, I found another strange document, tucked away in an old jewelry box of mine that Clara had always admired and frequently borrowed. It was a handwritten list in Clara's elegant script. At the top was the name of a prominent geriatric psychiatrist known for testifying in conservatorship cases. Below his name was a list of my assets, with estimated values next to them, and below that, a series of bullet points. Emphasize memory loss, mention her isolation, downplay our financial requests, frame new friends as manipulative. It was a strategic plan, a script for their character assassination of me. They had been rehearsing for this performance for a long time. This small piece of paper was, in its own way, more chilling than the forged legal documents. It was so personal, so intimate. It revealed the cold, calculating mind of my daughter-in-law, who could handle my treasured possessions while plotting my ruin. I added it to the file. It was another piece of the mosaic of their treachery, another weapon for my arsenal. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the hunter, and they had no idea I was tracking their every move. Just as Juliana had predicted, when the direct assault failed, my adversaries changed their tactics. The aggression vanished, replaced by a new strategy, a carefully orchestrated campaign of contrition. They had tried to break down my door and been repelled. Now they were going to stand on the porch and weep, hoping I would be foolish enough to let them in. It began with a bouquet of my favorite flowers, Casablanca lilies, delivered to my gate with a simple, unsigned card that read, "We're so sorry." I instructed the security guard to refuse the delivery. A day later, a letter arrived, not from their lawyer, but from Leo, handwritten on thick, expensive stationery. It was a torrent of remorse and self-flagellation. He wrote that he had been a terrible son, that he had been blinded by ambition and fear, that he had allowed Clara and Marcus Thorne to lead him down a dark path. He claimed the visit from Dr. Finch had been a terrible misunderstanding, an act of clumsy concern, not malice. He begged for a chance to speak with me, to apologize in person, to start to heal our family. It was a masterful performance, hitting all the notes of a prodigal son's return. But I read the words with Frank Russo's reports, lying on the desk beside me. I knew about his debts, his scams, the $25,000 payment to Dr. Finch. His apology was not a product of a guilty conscience, but of a desperate financial situation. The well had run dry, and he was dying of thirst. I fed the letter into my shredder. The next attempt came from Clara. She didn't write. She appeared. One afternoon, as I was returning from a walk, she was waiting outside my gates, alone. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the sharp, defiant woman who had shrieked threats into my intercom. In her place was a fragile, broken creature. She was dressed down, her expensive clothes replaced with a simple dress, her makeup subtle, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She didn't try to speak to me through the intercom. She just stood there, a picture of misery, until I drove up. She approached the car, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. She told me she was pregnant. The words hung in the air, a calculated emotional bomb. She spoke of her deep desire for our child to know its grandmother. She confessed that her actions had been driven by fear, fear for the baby's future, fear that I wouldn't provide for them. She cried, real tears streaming down her face, and told me that this baby had changed everything, that it had made her realize how important family was. She swore she had fired Marcus Thorne, and that she and Leo just wanted to make things right. For a single, treacherous moment, my heart wavered. A grandchild. The one thing I had longed for. The dream of continuing Richard's legacy. It was a temptation of the highest order, a perfectly chosen key designed to unlock the maternal instincts they had so thoroughly abused. But then I looked closer. I saw the calculation in her tear-filled eyes. I saw the actress playing her most challenging role. And I thought of the handwritten script I had found, the bullet points for my destruction. My rejection was cold, mature, and absolute. "Your supposed pregnancy is irrelevant to me, Clara," I said, my voice even, my hands steady on the steering wheel. "And even if it were true, you would not use a child as a pawn in your disgusting game." Her face crumpled, the mask of the sorrowful mother-to-be replaced by a flash of pure hatred. "You're a heartless bitch," she hissed, the venom returning to her voice. "No," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. "I am simply no longer a fool. You and Leo made a choice. You chose money over family. Now you have neither. Go home, Clara." I pressed the button to close my window, and the gate slid open, allowing me to pass through. I did not look back. The final temptation was the most insidious. It came in the form of a peace offering from Marcus Thorne, delivered to Juliana. They were willing to drop any and all plans to pursue a conservatorship. In return, all they asked for was a structured settlement. They proposed that I place $5 million into a trust for them, managed by a neutral third party. This, Thorne argued, would provide them with financial security, remove the source of conflict, and allow for a dignified and peaceful resolution for all parties. Juliana presented the offer to me without comment. It was, on the surface, a rational proposal. It would end the legal battle, spare me the public humiliation of a trial, and make them go away forever. It was a temptation to trade money for peace. $5 million was a huge sum, but it was only a third of my fortune. The old Evelyn, the one who equated money with love and peace, might have considered it. But I was not the old Evelyn. "Tell Mr. Thorne," I said to Juliana, my voice ringing with a clarity that felt like a bell, "that my counteroffer is this: nothing. They will receive nothing, not a single dollar. And tell him that I am no longer interested in a resolution. I am interested in justice." Juliana allowed herself a rare, thin smile. "I will convey your message with pleasure." I had rejected their lies, their emotional blackmail, and their attempts at a backroom deal. I had been tempted by the ghost of the family I wished I had, and I had turned away. There would be no settlement. There would be no reconciliation. There would only be the cold, hard truth, laid bare in a courtroom. They had mistaken my generosity for weakness. They were about to learn how strong I truly was. With the avenues of manipulation and negotiation firmly closed, I knew the inevitable court battle was looming. The prospect was daunting, a public spectacle designed to strip me of my dignity. The weight of it could have been crushing, but I was no longer facing it alone. The narrative Leo and Clara had tried to weave, that of a lonely old woman, isolated and paranoid, was a lie, and I was now surrounded by proof of its falsehood. My salvation came not from one source, but from many. It started with Eleanor Brooks, a woman from my garden club I had known casually for years. Hearing whispers of my troubles, she had invited me for tea. I was hesitant at first, wary of the gossip and pity, but Eleanor's sharp, intelligent eyes held only genuine concern. Emboldened by her kindness, I told her everything. As my story unfolded, I saw not shock on her face, but a grim, knowing recognition. When I finished, she took my hand. "Evelyn," she said, her voice firm, "welcome to the club." She then told me her own story. 5 years earlier, her 2 sons had tried to do the same thing to her after her husband passed away, attempting to have her declared incompetent to get their hands on his lucrative real estate portfolio. They had used the same tactics: feigned concern, whispers of senility to family friends, and legal threats. She had fought them, and she had won. "There are more of us than you think," she told me. "Women who have built lives, managed households, even run businesses, only to be treated like dotty children by the very people we raised the moment we become widows." That conversation opened a door to a world I never knew existed. Eleanor introduced me to a small, informal group of women who met weekly. They were all sharp, successful women in their 60s and 70s, a retired judge, a former CEO, a celebrated author, and every single one of them had a story that mirrored my own. They had all faced the Goneril and Regan situation, as the author Riley called it, referencing King Lear's treacherous daughters. They had battled greedy children, manipulative relatives, and a legal system that was often too quick to believe the worst about an older woman who dared to assert control over her own life and finances. Listening to their stories was a profound revelation. My pain, which had felt so specific and personal, was part of a larger, uglier pattern. We shared strategies, recommended lawyers and accountants, and, most importantly, offered each other unwavering, judgment-free support. We found a bitter humor in the predictability of our abusers' playbooks. The feigned concern, the gaslighting, the accusations of paranoia, it was all there, in every story. This sisterhood became my shield and my sounding board. They understood the unique pain of being betrayed by your own child, the grief that coexisted with the rage. They validated my decisions and bolstered my resolve. When I felt my anger wavering, a conversation with them would sharpen it back to a fine point. At the same time, I felt a deep need to reconnect with myself, to find a source of strength that was entirely my own, separate from the legal battle. I needed a spiritual cleansing. I decided to take a trip, alone, back to the small coastal town in Maine where Richard and I had bought a cottage when we were first married. We hadn't been there in years, and I had left it untouched since his death. The 3-hour drive north was a meditation. As the city gave way to rolling hills, and finally the rocky, pine-scented coastline, I felt the layers of stress begin to peel away. The cottage was just as we had left it, dusty and silent, filled with the ghosts of a happier time. For 3 days, I didn't answer my phone or check my email. I walked the beaches where Richard and I had walked, the cold Atlantic wind whipping away the last vestiges of my self-pity. I sat for hours on the porch, watching the tide ebb and flow, a steady, eternal rhythm that put my own turmoil into perspective. I spent my time not grieving the past, but drawing strength from it. I remembered the fierce, determined young woman I had been, working alongside Richard to build our first company. I remembered his unwavering belief in my intelligence and my judgment. He had never treated me as anything less than his equal, his partner in all things. How had I allowed his son to treat me with such profound disrespect? In the quiet of that cottage, I mourned the son I had lost, but I also forgave the mother I had been. I forgave her for her blindness, for her desperate need to be loved, for believing that money could shield her child from the world's hardships. She had made mistakes, but she had acted out of love, however misguided, and now she was gone. A stronger woman was in her place. On the last evening, I built a fire in the old stone hearth. I took out a piece of paper and wrote down everything I was letting go of. My guilt, my shame, my hope for reconciliation, my grief for the family I would never have. I folded the paper and dropped it into the flames. I watched until it was nothing but gray ash. It was a ritual of release, a spiritual severing of the ties that had bound me to a toxic past. I drove back to New York feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in years. The battle ahead was still daunting, but my purpose was clear. This was no longer just about protecting my money. It was about honoring the woman I had been and defending the woman I had become. It was for Richard. It was for my new sisters in arms. And most of all, it was for me. Armed with a renewed sense of purpose and the unwavering support of my friends, I returned from Maine ready to transition from defense to offense. The time for reacting was over. It was time to launch an attack of my own, one they would never see coming. My first move was with Frank Russo's devastating file of evidence. Juliana and I decided against a quiet countersuit. We wanted to strike a public and undeniable blow that would cripple their credibility before they could even set foot in a courtroom. Juliana drafted a series of letters, not to Leo and Clara, but to the other people they had defrauded. One letter went to the angel investors in Leo's sham tech company. It was a carefully worded document that laid out, with supporting evidence, how Leo had misrepresented his business and misused their funds. It didn't explicitly advise them to sue, but it gave them a crystal-clear roadmap to do so, practically gift-wrapping a fraud case for them. A similar letter, detailing Clara's business malpractice and potential criminal activity, was sent to the creditors and partners of her failed boutique. We had, in effect, lit a dozen fires all around them, forcing them to fight a multi-front war with opponents who had no emotional connection to them, only a financial one. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Two of Leo's investors, sons of powerful and litigious families, filed a lawsuit against him within a week. Clara's former business partner, seeing an opportunity to recoup her losses, launched her own legal action. Suddenly, Leo and Clara were buried in legal fees and depositions for cases that had nothing to do with me, but which were funded by the money they had taken from me. Their financial resources, already strained, were now hemorrhaging. My next attack was more subtle, aimed at their social standing. The world they inhabited was small and built on a fragile foundation of reputation and appearances. I decided to tear that foundation down. I hosted a large charity dinner at my home for the city's art museum, an event I had chaired for years. It was the first major social event I had hosted since Richard's death, and everyone who mattered was there. I knew Leo and Clara would hear about it, and I knew their exclusion would be a public and humiliating statement. But I took it a step further. During my speech, after thanking everyone for their generous donations, I made a special announcement. I spoke about my late husband's passion for supporting emerging artists and my desire to continue that legacy. Then I announced the formation of the new charitable trust that would, upon my death, inherit my entire estate to support the arts and to protect vulnerable elders. I didn't mention my son's name. I didn't have to. The message was clear to everyone in that room, a room filled with people who knew our family, who had heard Leo and Clara's whispers about my decline. In one fell swoop, I had reclaimed my own narrative. I was not a frail recluse. I was a powerful philanthropist, in complete control of my faculties and my fortune, shaping my own legacy. The whispers in the room shifted from concern for my health to speculation about what Leo could possibly have done to merit such a public and absolute disinheritance. Leo and Clara, predictably, did not take this lying down. Their resistance was desperate and clumsy. Realizing they could no longer control the narrative among our elite social circle, they stooped to a lower level, the tabloid press. A week after my charity dinner, an article appeared in a sleazy gossip column. It was an anonymous piece, but it was clearly their handiwork. It painted a lurid picture of a grieving Manhattan widow being manipulated by a cabal of predatory lawyers and so-called friends into cutting her devoted son out of his inheritance. It hinted at my eccentric behavior and questionable mental state, turning my philanthropy into a sign of instability. The article was humiliating, a gross distortion of the truth designed to wound and discredit me. For a moment, the old vulnerability returned. The feeling of being exposed, of my private pain being turned into public spectacle, was nauseating. But then, my new strength took over. I realized this was not a sign of their power, but of their desperation. They had lost control and were now resorting to throwing mud in the hopes that some of it would stick. My resistance was swift and decisive. Juliana immediately filed a libel lawsuit against the tabloid, but more effectively, my friends rallied around me. The retired judge in our group, who knew every editor in the city, made a few phone calls. My author friend wrote a blistering op-ed about the disgusting trend of elder abuse and how easily the concerned family narrative can be used as a cover for greed, without mentioning my name, but making the context unmistakable. I gave a single, exclusive interview to a respected highbrow magazine, where I spoke not of my family drama, but of my passion for philanthropy and my new mission to help victims of financial abuse. I was calm, articulate, and powerful. I was turning their every attack into a platform for my own strength. They had tried to isolate me, and I had built an army of allies. They had tried to paint me as insane, and I had established myself as a formidable public figure. They were playing checkers, moving one piece at a time. I was playing chess, thinking 3 moves ahead. The court date was approaching, and they were walking into a trap of their own making, weakened, discredited, and fighting battles on all sides, completely unaware that I held the evidence that would be their final undoing. The day of the court hearing arrived not with a storm, but with a quiet, steely calm. I dressed in a dark blue suit, the color of power and stability, my only adornment a simple pearl necklace Richard had given me. As I looked at my reflection, I saw not a victim, but a survivor. The lines on my face were deeper than they had been a few months ago, but my eyes were clear and bright with purpose. The courtroom was a sterile, impersonal space, all polished wood and muted colors, a theater for the final act of this tragedy. Leo and Clara sat at the opposing table with their lawyer, Marcus Thorne. They looked worn down. The other lawsuits had clearly taken their toll. Leo's face was pale and strained, and Clara's attempts at a composed, elegant appearance were betrayed by the nervous way she shredded a tissue in her lap. They refused to look at me. Thorne began his argument, his voice echoing with practiced solemnity. He painted me as a vulnerable, grieving widow who had fallen under the influence of manipulative new friends and an avaricious lawyer. He presented my recent actions, rewriting my will, launching my charitable trust, changing the locks, not as acts of self-preservation, but as evidence of paranoia and delusion. He spoke of my sudden and irrational decision to cut off my loving and supportive son. His key witness was Dr. Alistair Finch, who took the stand and testified with clinical detachment about his concerns regarding my cognitive state, based on the single, fraudulent visit to my home. It was a compelling performance designed to play on every stereotype of the frail, elderly woman. But it was a house of cards, and Juliana Vance was about to unleash a hurricane. Juliana's cross-examination of Dr. Finch was a masterclass in controlled demolition. She began quietly, asking him to confirm the details of his visit. Then she presented the evidence, a bank statement showing the $25,000 payment from Leo's Shell Corporation to Dr. Finch's failing practice just 2 weeks before his friendly visit. The doctor sputtered, his professional composure cracking. Juliana then produced the record of his recent reprimand from the medical board for ethical violations. By the time she was finished, Dr. Finch was not a credible medical expert. He was a hired gun, a discredited professional whose testimony was now utterly worthless. Next, she called Leo to the stand. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Juliana didn't attack him. She simply presented the facts, one by one. She showed the court the 5-year summary of the $1.7 million I had given him. She brought up the multiple lawsuits he was now facing from his angel investors. Then she produced the ultimate weapon, the forged power of attorney document I had found. "Mr. Ashton," Juliana asked, her voice dangerously soft, "can you identify this document? Is this not a power of attorney form that would grant you total control over your mother's $15 million estate, which you prepared 6 months before you became so concerned about her mental health?" Leo stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. He paled, stammered, denied. But the forgery was clear, the intent undeniable. The final piece of evidence she presented was the handwritten note from Clara, the script for my character assassination. As Juliana read Clara's cold, calculating words aloud, "Emphasize memory loss. Frame new friends as manipulative." A wave of audible gasps went through the courtroom. Finally, I took the stand. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply told the truth, calmly and clearly. I spoke of my love for my son and the slow, painful realization of his betrayal. I detailed the spying, the threats, the manipulation. I looked directly at the judge, a woman with intelligent, discerning eyes, and I concluded my testimony. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "my son and his wife are not here because they are concerned for my well-being. They are here because they see me not as a person, but as a bank vault they have been locked out of. My decision to protect myself and my assets was not an act of insanity. It was the sanest decision I have ever made. The judge's verdict was swift and brutal. She dismissed the conservatorship petition, her words scathing. She called Leo and Clara's actions a textbook case of attempted financial elder abuse and a shameful display of greed and filial ingratitude. She ordered them to pay all of my legal fees, a sum that was astronomical. But she went a step further. Citing the evidence of the forged document and the conspiracy with Dr. Finch, she announced she was referring the entire case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. It was over. The victory was absolute, more complete than I could have imagined. Leo and Clara sat frozen in their chairs, their faces a mixture of shock and utter ruin. As I walked out of the courtroom, a free woman, I did not look back. The aftermath for them was a slow, inexorable collapse. The criminal investigation led to charges of fraud and conspiracy. Buried in legal debt from multiple lawsuits, they were forced to declare bankruptcy. They lost their downtown loft. Their names became poison in the social circles they had tried so desperately to conquer. The last I heard, Leo was working a low-level sales job, and Clara was a hostess at a restaurant, the kind of honest work my generosity had allowed them to avoid their entire lives. They had lost everything because they had been willing to destroy everything to get more. My new life began the day the old one ended. I sold the large house, a place now tainted by the ghosts of their betrayal, and moved into a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the park. I threw myself into the work of my charitable foundation, finding immense purpose in helping others. My circle of friends, my true family, became the center of my world. We traveled, we laughed, we supported each other. There is no happy ending in the traditional sense. The wound of my son's betrayal will never fully heal. But the victory is in the life I have built from the ashes. It's a life of freedom, purpose, and peace. A life lived on my own terms. They told everyone I had lost my mind. In the end, it was by finding my strength, my sanity, and my self-worth that I caused them to lose everything. And that is a victory more valuable than any fortune.